My name is Michael Ashton, and at 65 years old, I never thought my own Thanksgiving table would turn into the scene of my deepest humiliation. Imagine sitting there, surrounded by family, when your billionaire son suddenly raises a glass and asks if you received his $100,000 gift. I hadn't. And in that moment, as the room fell silent and my daughter-in-law froze, I realized something was terribly wrong. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one. Thanksgiving in Chicago has always carried a certain weight in my family. For decades, the Ashton table was where laughter, tradition, and respect lived side by side. But this year, as I sat at the long mahogany table in my son Daniel's mansion, I felt none of it. Instead, the room seemed heavy, suffocating, as if the very air carried a secret I hadn't been invited to know. The fire crackled in the stone hearth. The table gleamed under crystal chandeliers, lined with every imaginable dish a caterer could prepare. And at the head of the table sat my son, Daniel Ashton, billionaire businessman, glowing with the confidence only great wealth seems to gift a man. He raised his glass, his blue eyes sweeping over the table with pride. Then they locked onto me. "Dad," he said loudly, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "did you get the gift I sent you? The $100,000 wire?" The chatter at the table stopped. Forks froze midair. My heart lurched. I blinked, trying to make sense of his words. $100,000? A wire? I hadn't received a single dime. "What? What gift?" I asked, my voice low but trembling. The silence tightened like a noose. It was then that I saw her, my daughter-in-law, Claire. She sat perfectly still, her elegant hands folded neatly in her lap, her face pale but composed. But her eyes betrayed her. For the briefest second, they widened, then hardened, and her posture stiffened like ice had crept into her veins. She knew something. Daniel chuckled, but it was the kind of laugh that dripped with contempt. "Come on, Dad. Don't play coy. I sent it weeks ago. You must have seen it." I shook my head slowly, the pit in my stomach sinking deeper. "No, Daniel, I haven't received anything." The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some cousins looked down at their plates, others at me with pity, and a few with curiosity, as though they were witnessing a theater performance they hadn't bought tickets for. My face burned. Daniel leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine like a man who had just caught someone in a lie. "That's strange, because the transfer shows completed on my end." He turned his gaze to Claire. "Doesn't it, honey?" Claire's jaw tightened. She swallowed, but her lips barely parted. "Yes," she whispered, almost inaudible. And in that moment, I understood. Something was very, very wrong. The room buzzed with quiet whispers, but I heard none of them. My mind raced, searching for explanations, searching for the thread that would pull this tangled knot apart. Why hadn't I received it? Why had Claire frozen like that? Why would my own son embarrass me in front of the entire family over something I never knew existed? I clenched my fists under the tablecloth, feeling the sting of betrayal wash over me. For 65 years, I had built a life on dignity, loyalty, and providing for this very son. I had sacrificed sleep, health, and dreams to ensure he had every chance I never did. And now, here I sat, made to look like a liar, a fool, a senile old man who couldn't keep track of his own finances. "Maybe the bank made a mistake," I muttered, though I hated the weakness in my own voice. Daniel smirked. "Banks don't make mistakes like that, Dad. You probably just forgot." Forgot. The word sliced through me. Forgotten. That was how he saw me, an aging man losing grip on reality. A burden. I glanced back at Claire. She wouldn't meet my eyes. Her frozen silence screamed louder than any words could. I knew, deep down, she was part of this, whatever this was, and Daniel's smugness only confirmed it. The food on my plate had turned to dust. I couldn't swallow another bite. The family dinner I had once cherished now felt like a courtroom, and I was the accused. As the laughter slowly returned around me, awkward, forced, but returning nonetheless, I sat there hollowed out, staring at the golden turkey centerpiece I couldn't taste. My son's voice echoed in my mind. "You probably just forgot." I had not forgotten. I had been erased, and yet, as humiliation burned inside me, a quiet fire lit somewhere deeper. It was faint, fragile, but alive. If Daniel and Claire thought they could humiliate me, diminish me, or steal from me, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I had lived through worse storms than this. I pressed my napkin against my mouth, stood slowly from the table, and excused myself with as much dignity as I could muster. But every step away from that table felt like a nail hammered into the coffin of the father-son bond I once believed unbreakable. That night, as I sat alone in the guest room of his sprawling mansion, I replayed every detail: Daniel's mocking tone, Claire's frozen silence, the whispers, the smirks, the sting of being called forgetful, and the bitter taste of betrayal from the very people I had loved most. I couldn't sleep. My mind churned. Where had that money gone? Had it ever been sent at all? Or had Daniel orchestrated this entire charade to humiliate me? And why had Claire frozen like a deer in headlights? Questions swirled. But one truth settled deep in my chest like a stone. Something had been stolen from me. And not just money. My dignity, my legacy, my place in this family. And I would not let it stand. You see, betrayal doesn't announce itself gently. It barges in during the moments you least expect. At a Thanksgiving table, under the glow of chandeliers, surrounded by the very people who should have been your sanctuary. And when it does, it leaves a scar so deep, it demands reckoning. That Thanksgiving was not the beginning of the story, though. It was merely the breaking point. The moment the mask slipped, the silence screamed, and I understood the war I was now in. But the roots of this betrayal? They went back further, much further, long before Daniel had a fortune, long before Claire walked into our lives, long before the word forgot was ever used to cut me down. And if you want to understand how a father comes to take revenge on his own son and daughter-in-law, you have to go back with me, back to where it all began. When people look at my son Daniel now, they see the billionaire, the sharp suits, the private jet, the mansion in Lake Forest. They see a man who sits on top of Chicago's skyline as if he built it himself. But when I look at him, I still see the boy with scraped knees who used to run to me for comfort, the boy I once carried on my shoulders through the city park, promising him the world even though I had nothing in my pockets but hope. I wasn't born into wealth, far from it. My father worked the steel mills, and I grew up in a neighborhood where you learned early that nothing came for free. My hands have known calluses longer than they've known comfort. I worked 3 jobs through my 20s, pouring concrete by day, driving cabs at night, and fixing boilers whenever a neighbor's heat gave out. Every dollar I earned had a purpose: rent, food, and eventually, Daniel's education. When his mother passed, God rest her soul, Daniel was only 10. Losing her almost destroyed me. But in her final hours, she had gripped my hand and whispered, "Promise me you'll give him everything I couldn't." That promise became my life's mission. I never remarried. I didn't want distraction. Daniel became the center of my universe. I coached his little league games, stayed up late with him to finish school projects, and took on overtime shifts so I could buy him the good cleats. When his teammates mocked him for wearing hand-me-downs, every sacrifice felt worth it because it kept that light in his eyes burning. And he was smart, smarter than I ever was. By high school, he was already talking about business deals, investments, and dreams of skyscrapers with his name on them. I'd come home exhausted, smelling of sweat and steel, and he'd sit across from me at the kitchen table with a notebook full of ideas. "Dad," he'd say, "one day, I'm going to be so rich you'll never have to work again." I believed him. When he got into Northwestern on a partial scholarship, I nearly cried with pride. I scraped together the rest of the tuition, sold my truck, and picked up night shifts at the factory. Those years nearly broke me. I aged 10 years in 4, my back screaming with every shift. But I never told Daniel. He only saw the checks, never the toll it took on my body. I wanted him to focus on his future, not my pain. He graduated top of his class, landed an internship at a real estate firm, and within a few years, he was buying properties with investors who saw his sharp mind and relentless drive. I watched from the sidelines with pride swelling in my chest. The boy I had raised through blood and sweat had become a man of stature. But somewhere along the way, that boy I knew started to fade. It began with small things, holidays where he'd arrive late, phone calls that went unanswered. "Sorry, Dad, I'm swamped," he'd say. I told myself it was natural. Success demanded sacrifice. But then came the looks, the subtle tones in his voice, as if he'd outgrown me. And then there was Claire. The first time he brought her home, I wanted to like her. She was beautiful, poised, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made it hers without trying. But there was something in the way she looked at me, like I was a relic, a museum piece to be respected from a distance, but never truly engaged with. She called me Mr. Ashton at first. Never Michael, never Dad. I corrected her once, awkwardly. "Please, just Michael." She smiled politely, but the name never changed. Daniel was besotted with, and who was I to stand in the way of love? But I noticed the way she'd frown when I used my old truck instead of hiring a car service, the way she once wrinkled her nose when she saw me bring a casserole in a foil tray to their housewarming party. "Oh, that's sweet," she'd said, her tone dripping with condescension. Daniel laughed with her. I laughed too, but inside it stung. The humiliations grew sharper with time. At their wedding, I was seated 2 tables away from the head table, next to distant cousins I barely knew. When I asked Daniel why, he said, "Dad, it's just logistic. We had to keep VIPs close." I wanted to ask, "Am I not a VIP in your life?" But I stayed silent, swallowing the hurt like I always did. They built their empire together. Properties, hotels, luxury condos. Daniel had the business mind, but Claire had the social connections, the charities, the galas, the whispered introductions to Chicago's elite. Soon, they weren't just wealthy. They were untouchable. And me? I was the quiet old man in the background. The father who had given everything but was now expected to take his place in the shadows. Still, I told myself they loved me in their own way. Daniel would occasionally send checks, calling them gifts. I never asked for them, but I knew he saw them as gestures of gratitude. Only, he'd make sure to announce them at family gatherings, turning private appreciation into public performance. "Dad, did you cash the check I sent?" he'd ask loudly, smiling at the table. And when I nodded, everyone would clap him on the back like he was a saint. I hated those moments. Not because I didn't appreciate the help, but because it reduced our bond to a transaction. I didn't raise him for money. I raised him for love, for legacy, for family. And Claire, she always seemed to be watching, as if measuring how much longer I'd be useful. Once, I overheard her whispering to Daniel after I left the room, "Your father really should think about moving into something smaller. That house of his is outdated. We could sell it and put the money to better use." Better use. That house was where Daniel had taken his first steps, where his mother had drawn her last breath, where every memory I held dear lived. To her, it was just square footage on a ledger. I told myself to let it go. Families change. People change. But in my gut, a storm was gathering. It showed itself in small ways first. Birthdays where Daniel forgot to call until the next day. Dinners where Claire would steer conversations toward how difficult it must be for me to manage finances at my age. Once, when I offered to take my granddaughter to the zoo, she smiled thinly and said, "Maybe when she's older. You know, with your knees, we wouldn't want you to overexert yourself." I laughed it off, but that night, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the family photos on the wall, wondering when I had become a liability instead of a father. The final red flag before that infamous Thanksgiving came one quiet afternoon. I had stopped by Daniel's office unannounced, just to surprise him with lunch. His secretary looked flustered, but let me in. Through the glass door, I saw Claire leaning close to Daniel, whispering something. When they noticed me, her smile vanished, and his tightened. "Dad, you should have called," he said, his tone clipped. "I just wanted to see you," I replied, holding up the sandwiches. Claire's eyes flicked to Daniel's desk, where I noticed a document half covered by a folder. A bank statement, maybe, or something financial. But when my gaze lingered a moment too long, Claire slid the folder over it, her movements smooth but deliberate. Something about that gesture haunted me. It was the same frozen stiffness I would later see at Thanksgiving, the same calculation masked by poise. They accepted the sandwiches, thanked me half-heartedly, and I left. But as I walked out of that towering glass building, the wind biting against my face, a thought I never wanted to entertain whispered through my mind. What if the son I sacrificed everything for was no longer on my side? People often think betrayal happens in whispers, behind closed doors, hidden away. But in my life, it happened under glaring lights, with cameras flashing, and my family watching as if they were attending a performance. It was 3 weeks after that disastrous Thanksgiving dinner. I was still shaken by Daniel's stunt with the gift, still turning Claire's frozen expression over in my mind, like a puzzle I couldn't solve. But what came next stripped me of everything I thought I still had. I lived in the old brick house on Ashland Avenue. It wasn't much by Billionaire standards, but it was mine, paid off, brick by brick, with sweat and overtime. It held every memory: Daniel's baby footsteps, his mother's laughter, the faint pencil marks on the kitchen wall where I measured his height every year until he towered over me. That house was more than walls. It was my history. One cold Friday morning, I woke to a knock on the door. When I opened it, 2 men in suits stood on the porch, papers in hand. Behind them, a police officer waited by his car. "Mr. Ashton?" one of the men asked. "Yes, you've been served." He handed me the envelope. My hands shook as I tore it open. Legal jargon blurred before my eyes, but I understood enough. Eviction. The house, my house, had been transferred into a trust 6 months ago, under Daniel's name, and now they were moving to sell it. I staggered back, gripping the doorframe. This must be a mistake. "This is my house." The officer's expression was sympathetic but firm. "I'm sorry, sir. You'll need to vacate within 30 days. My vision swam. I remembered Daniel's visit months earlier, when he had insisted on helping me organize my finance. He had convinced me to sign some documents, assuring me it was only to protect the property from taxes and make sure the house stayed in the family. I had trusted him, my son, and now I realized I had signed away the very roof over my head. The men left, and I sat on the edge of my worn armchair, the papers trembling in my hands. My chest felt tight, as if the walls were closing in. For the first time in years, I wept, not just for the house, but for the cruel realization that my son had orchestrated it all. Days blurred together. I tried calling Daniel. He ignored me. I sent messages, short, desperate ones. "Please call me. Let's talk." Nothing. Finally, after a week, Claire called. "Michael," she said smoothly, her voice like cold glass. "We understand this is hard for you, but Daniel and I think it's for the best. That house is old, falling apart. You shouldn't be burdened at your age." "Burdened?" My voice cracked. "That house is all I have left. Your husband, my son, tricked me. He stole it from me. There was silence. Then Claire's tone sharpened. You signed the papers, Michael. No one forced you. Maybe it's better to accept that you're not as capable with details anymore. Daniel worries about you. I closed my eyes, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles. Capable? I've worked my entire life for him. For you. And now you take my home? Her response was a dagger. It's not about taking. It's about efficiency. We'll make sure you're comfortable. Daniel already transferred funds into your account. You'll be fine. Funds. Always money. As if money could replace roots, replace dignity, replace love. I hung up before she could say more. The weeks passed in a haze of humiliation. Neighbors whispered as movers carried my belongings out. Some tried to console me, but their pity cut deeper than silence. I could feel their eyes on me. The father of the billionaire, thrown out of his own house. The final blow came during the public auction. Daniel didn't bother to hide it. He wanted it known. My house, the Ashton home, was sold in front of a crowd of developers and reporters. The story made the local paper. Real estate mogul reclaims family asset. I was there, standing in the back, my hat pulled low. I watched Daniel shake hands with buyers, smiling for the cameras, while Claire stood beside him in her designer coat. Her hand looped through his arm like a queen presenting her king. Not once did they look at me. To them, I was invisible. Reporters buzzed around. One of them, a young man with a notebook, approached me. Mr. Ashton, are you related to Daniel Ashton? I swallowed the lump in my throat. I'm his father. The reporter's eyebrows lifted. And how do you feel about him buying back his childhood home? I couldn't answer. My voice failed me. All I could do was nod slightly and walk away, the cold wind cutting into my bones. That night, I sat alone in a dingy rented apartment on the south side, surrounded by boxes of my life, reduced to cardboard. The silence was deafening. For 65 years, I had built, provided, and sacrificed. And now, I was left with nothing but 4 peeling walls and the echo of my son's betrayal. I tried to eat, but the food turned to ash in my mouth. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Claire's frozen stare at Thanksgiving, Daniel's mocking smirk, the legal papers in my hands, the auction gavel slamming down. It wasn't just the house. It was my place in the family, my dignity, my very identity as a father. Daniel hadn't just taken property. He had stripped me of honor, paraded my downfall before the world, and called it efficiency. I sat by the window that night, watching the city lights flicker. Chicago, the city I had given my life to, stretched endlessly, alive with noise and ambition. Somewhere, Daniel was celebrating his victory, surrounded by luxury and praise. And I was here, discarded, forgotten. The heartbreak was almost unbearable. My chest ached with every breath. I thought of his mother, what she would say if she saw this. I thought of the boy he once was, running to me with scraped knees. Where had that boy gone? I pressed my hand against the cold glass, staring out at the glittering skyline Daniel now claimed as his kingdom. The pain hollowed me out, left me raw and broken. For the first time, I felt truly old. And yet, in the deepest part of that silence, beneath the grief and humiliation, something stirred. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even fully formed, but it was there, a flicker. I didn't speak it. I didn't name it. But as I sat in that lonely apartment, staring out at the city my son believed he owned, I felt it grow, steady and unshakable. I had lost everything, but I was not finished. When you've been humiliated, when your dignity has been stripped bare, people expect you to fold. They expect silence, retreat, and resignation. Daniel and Claire thought I'd accept my new life in that cramped apartment, cash their hush-money funds, and fade into irrelevance. But they didn't know me anymore. They had forgotten who raised them, who sacrificed, who learned to survive on scraps and sweat. I didn't have wealth. I didn't have influence. But I still had time, patience, and the sharpness that comes from a lifetime of navigating hard men in harder places. You don't build 40 years of survival in Chicago without learning how to fight quiet battles. It began with the papers. I pulled out the eviction documents, the trust transfer, every sheet Daniel had made me sign. I studied them late at night at the small kitchen table of my apartment, my glasses slipping down my nose. Most men my age would have tossed them in despair, but I read every line like scripture. And then I noticed something, a clause, hidden deep in the language, buried under the weight of legal jargon, was a line about maintenance obligations. It stated that until the property was sold and transferred to a third party, the trustee, that was Daniel, was responsible for maintaining the property to city code. Any violations would incur heavy fines, payable not by the trust, but by the trustee personally. I smiled for the first time in weeks. The old house wasn't in perfect shape. It was sturdy, yes, but aging. I knew every flaw, every creak, every repair Daniel had ignored when he took control, and I knew exactly where to start. I called the city inspector's office, not anonymously, openly. "This is Michael Ashton. I want to report unsafe conditions at 1243 Ashland Avenue." My voice didn't waver. I listed everything. The cracked foundation, the outdated wiring, the sagging roof I had begged Daniel to fix years ago. A week later, the house was cited. Thousands of dollars in fines landed squarely on Daniel's desk. And because the property was under his trust, he couldn't simply dodge them. He had to pay. When I heard through a cousin that Daniel had stormed around his office after the notice came in, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: satisfaction. It was small, yes, but sharp. My first strike. But I wasn't done. I started digging deeper. Years of working-class life had introduced me to people most billionaires never notice: clerks, clerics, janitors, men and women who live in the margins but know where the cracks in the system lie. I went to old friends, men I hadn't spoken to in years, and asked quiet questions about Daniel's companies. How do the permits look? Any shaky loans? Where does Claire handle the charities? Chicago is a city that whispers. If you listen closely, you hear everything. I learned that Daniel's latest luxury condo project had already been delayed by zoning concerns. The press hadn't picked up on it yet, but the city planning board was holding out for missing paperwork. Missing paperwork Claire had promised would be smoothed over. That gave me another idea. I still had contacts in the clerk's office, men who remembered me from years back when I helped patch their boilers on freezing nights. They hadn't forgotten. A favor asked, a folder misplaced, a signature delayed. It was remarkable what could happen when people respected you as more than a paycheck. 2 weeks later, Daniel's project hit a roadblock. Permits delayed indefinitely. Investors began to murmur. Claire smoothed it over in public, smiling through clenched teeth, but I knew she felt the cracks. Daniel called me for the first time since Thanksgiving. "Dad," he said, his tone sharp. "What the hell are you doing?" I feigned innocence. "Doing? I've just been settling into my new place. Why?" "Don't play dumb. Someone's been stirring things up. Inspectors, clerks. Things are getting complicated." His voice was low, dangerous. "Complicated?" I let the word hang, savoring it. Maybe that's just life reminding you not everything can be controlled with money. There was silence on the other end. For the first time, I could feel him unsettled. Then he snapped, "Stay out of my business," and hung up. I sat back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. He didn't know. He didn't understand that I wasn't fighting to win overnight. I was planting seeds, letting doubt grow inside his empire. Billionaires hate uncertainty more than anything. It eats at their confidence, it shakes their investors, it gnaws at their image. And Claire, she began to sense something too. I could see it in her eyes when we crossed paths at a family birthday gathering. She kept her smile plastered on, but her gaze darted toward me with calculation. The kind of look that says, What do you know? What are you planning? I didn't give her an answer. I just raised my glass and nodded politely, as if nothing at all had changed. But deep inside, everything had. The satisfaction wasn't just in the money he lost, or the delays I caused. It was in reminding myself and him that I wasn't finished, that beneath the wrinkles and the gray hair, there was still steel, that I was still his father, and he had underestimated me. Each small move was like a drop of water wearing down stone, and with every drop, Daniel's mask of invincibility cracked a little more. That night, as I walked home under the glow of the street lamps, I thought of the Thanksgiving table again. His smug smile, Claire's frozen silence, the humiliation I had swallowed whole. It no longer burned the same way. It fueled me. I wasn't just the discarded father anymore. I was the quiet storm gathering on the horizon. And then, as I reached my door, I stopped. My hand rested on the knob, my breath visible in the cold Chicago air. A thought returned to me, sharp and undeniable. That's when I remembered. I still had something left. Daniel never stayed unsettled for long. He was too arrogant for that. Billionaires don't believe in losing. They believe in crushing obstacles until they disappear. And to him, I had become an obstacle. The first blow came in the form of a lawyer's letter slipped under my apartment door. The words were cold and merciless. A cease and desist, accusing me of interference with Daniel's business. It listed the fines from the house citations, the delayed permits, even suggesting I had abused city resources by reporting unsafe conditions. The letter threatened lawsuits, legal costs, and the possibility of freezing my bank account if I continued. I sat in that dim apartment, letter trembling in my hands, rage boiling beneath my ribs. He wasn't satisfied stealing my house, humiliating me publicly. He wanted to silence me, to grind me down until I begged for mercy. The next blow came in person. Daniel invited me to his office, something he hadn't done willingly in years. I should have known it wasn't reconciliation. The office towered over downtown Chicago, glass gleaming, the lobby full of marble and steel. I sat in his corner suite, surrounded by trophies of wealth, while Claire perched at his side like a silent queen. "Dad," Daniel began smoothly, "you're making things difficult. These inspectors, these delays, they're connected to you. And if you keep this up, I'll have no choice but to take legal action. I don't want to do that, but you're leaving me no choice." I clenched my jaw. "You tricked me, Daniel. You stole my home." He sighed, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. "I protected the asset. You signed. You're forgetting things. It happens at your age. Gaslighting. Clear and cruel." Claire leaned forward, her voice velvet but sharp. "Michael, we care about you. That's why Daniel set aside funds for you. You don't need a house or complicated property. Let us handle things. Just trust us." I looked at them both. The son I raised, the woman who had sunk her claws into him, and for a moment, the weight of their betrayal almost crushed me. They wanted me to believe I was slipping, that I was incapable, that I was the problem. But they didn't know the truth. Because while they believed they had stolen everything, I had kept something back. It began months earlier, before Thanksgiving, when Daniel first pressured me to transfer the house. I had been suspicious even then. I didn't want to show it. But when he slid those documents across the table, something in my gut told me to be careful. So I did what I had always done when something smelled rotten. I took a copy. That night, I brought the papers to an old friend, Tom Callahan. Tom and I had worked the mills together in our youth. He had gone on to law school and, though he never made partner in a big firm, he built a modest practice helping working men navigate contracts, wills, and trusts. "Michael," he had said, sliding his glasses down his nose as he read, "this trust gives Daniel control, yes, but not absolute control. Look here. See this clause? You reserved beneficiary rights." He can't liquidate the property without your signed approval. And more importantly, he's bound to uphold fiduciary duty. If he acts against your interest knowingly, it's fraud. I had nodded slowly, relief and anger mixing in my chest. Tom leaned closer. Keep this copy safe. Someday, you might need it. And so I did. Now, months later, sitting across from Daniel in his glittering office, I pulled the folder from my bag and slid it across his desk. You remember these, don't you? I said quietly. Daniel's smile faltered. He flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening. Claire's eyes narrowed. You left out some details when you explained them, I continued, my voice steady. You made it sound like I had no rights, but I do. And I have legal counsel who's very interested in how you misrepresented these documents to your own father. The silence in that office was heavier than any courtroom. Daniel's face reddened, his mask slipping. Claire reached for his arm, but he jerked away. You think this will stop me? He spat, finally. You think some old paperwork will undo everything I've built? I leaned forward, my voice low but sharp as steel. No, Daniel. I don't think it'll undo everything, but it'll put a spotlight on how you treat your own blood. Investors, reporters, your board, they'll eat this alive. A billionaire son defrauding his aging father? That story writes itself. Claire's composure cracked. For the first time, I saw panic flicker in her eyes. She whispered, Daniel, calm down. But he wasn't calm. His empire had always been built on control. Control of markets, of people, of image. And now, for the first time, he couldn't control me. I stood slowly, collecting my folder. I'm not here to destroy you, son. Not yet, but understand this. You don't hold all the cards. Not anymore. We locked eyes across that polished desk. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I saw something in Daniel's gaze I hadn't seen in years. Not pity. Not contempt. Fear. I turned to leave, my footsteps echoing against marble floors. But before I reached the door, Daniel's voice rang out, low and venomous. This isn't over, Dad. I paused, hand on the doorknob, and looked back at him. His face was tight, his fists clenched, Claire whispering furiously in his ear. I said softly, It isn't. The standoff hung in the air, thick and electric. The game had changed. He had thought me broken, humiliated, erased. But now he knew I was still standing, and I had weapons he never expected. And as I walked out into the cold Chicago wind, I felt it for the first time since the betrayal. The shift, the tide turning. The real war had just begun. The confrontation came on Christmas Eve. Daniel had arranged a grand family gathering at his mansion, as though nothing had happened. He and Claire wanted a show, their empire gleaming under the lights, their status displayed for relatives, investors, and friends alike. The mansion glowed like a cathedral of wealth, with crystal chandeliers, polished marble floors, and a towering tree dressed in gold ornaments. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to stay home, alone, rather than walk into the lion's den. But something told me this was the moment. The stage was set. The audience gathered, and I had waited long enough. When I arrived, whispers followed me. Everyone knew I had been forced out of my house. Some pitied me, some judged me. Daniel welcomed me with a smile too wide, too polished, the kind of smile meant for cameras. Claire kissed my cheek, her lips cold as glass. Dad, Daniel said loudly, so everyone nearby could hear. I'm glad you came. After all, we're family. No hard feelings, right? I nodded silently, letting him gloat. Dinner was lavish, of course. Plates of caviar, fine wine, dishes I couldn't pronounce. But as the courses came and went, I saw what Daniel was doing. Every toast, every anecdote was meant to cement his dominance, his image as the generous, powerful patriarch. At one point, he raised his glass, turning to me with that same smug gleam I'd seen at Thanksgiving. Dad, he said, voice dripping with performance, I hope you're comfortable in your new place. We've made sure you're taken care of. After all, You don't need much at your age, do you? The table chuckled politely. Claire smirked. I let the laughter settle. Then I placed my napkin neatly on the table and stood. My heart beat steady, not with rage, but with clarity. Since we're speaking so openly, I said, my voice calm but cutting through the chatter, there's something I think everyone here should know. The room fell silent. All eyes turned toward me. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a slim folder, the same one I had shown Daniel weeks earlier in his office. But this time, I had added something more. I laid the documents on the table, sliding them toward the center. This, I said, is the trust Daniel tricked me into signing. What he didn't tell anyone was that I retained beneficiary rights, and that he has a legal duty not to act against my interest, which, I think you'll all agree, he has violated repeatedly. Gasps rippled across the table. A few relatives leaned forward, scanning the papers. Claire stiffened, her hand gripping Daniel's arm. And this, I continued, pulling out another paper, is the amendment I filed last week with the help of my attorney. It transfers beneficiary rights, not to Daniel, but to my granddaughter, Emily. All heads turned to the far side of the table, where Emily, Daniel's 12-year-old daughter, sat wide-eyed. She looked between her parents and me, confusion giving way to a shy smile. Daniel shot up from his chair, face red. "You can't do that," he barked. I looked him square in the eye. I already did. Claire hissed, "Michael, you don't understand the consequences." "Oh, I understand," I said, my voice rising just enough to carry. "The house you stole, the funds you flaunted, the humiliation you inflicted on me, all of it was to make me small, to erase me. But I built that house. I raised you in it. And now, it belongs to your daughter, not you." The room was electric. Investors shifted uncomfortably. Family members whispered furiously. Daniel's empire had been pierced, not by money, but by honor, by the exposure of his betrayal, laid bare in front of everyone who mattered. Daniel leaned across the table, fists clenched, his voice trembling with fury. "You think this makes you noble? You've embarrassed yourself. You've embarrassed me. You're nothing but a bitter old man clinging to scraps." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at him, my son, the boy I had once carried on my shoulders, and spoke the line I had been holding in my heart for months. "Better a bitter old man with honor," I said softly, "than a rich young man with no soul." Silence. Utter, suffocating silence. Daniel's jaw worked, but no words came. Claire's face drained of color. Around the table, heads turned away from them. No one clapped. No one laughed. The spell was broken. I sat back down slowly, reclaiming my seat at the table, not as a beggar, not as a relic, but as a father who had stood his ground. The feast continued awkwardly, the air heavy with what had been revealed. Daniel sulked. Claire whispered furiously, but neither dared challenge me again. The gloating was over. The performance ended. And though I had lost much, my home, my trust in my own blood, I had reclaimed something far more important: my dignity, my voice, my place. That night, as I walked out of the mansion into the crisp Chicago air, I felt lighter than I had in years. Revenge hadn't made me young again. It hadn't erased the pain, but it had given me peace. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel knew exactly what it felt like to be powerless. The weeks that followed that Christmas confrontation reshaped everything. Daniel's board of directors called an emergency meeting after whispers spread about the trust documents. Investors don't like uncertainty, and they certainly don't like scandal. Claire tried to spin it as a family misunderstanding, but no one believed her once my attorney quietly leaked the truth to the right ears. Daniel's project funding wavered. Delays compounded. And for the first time in years, cracks appeared in his empire. He wasn't ruined, not yet, but his aura of invincibility was gone. Among family, his word no longer carried the same weight. At dinners, Conversations no longer hushed when he entered the room. People looked at him differently, as if seeing not a titan, but a man capable of betraying his own blood. And Claire? She moved like a ghost in those circles. The same woman who once sparkled in every room now lingered at the edges, her smile brittle. She had built her identity on perfection, but perfection doesn't survive the stench of betrayal. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. Their punishment wasn't mine to deliver. It was life's. As for me, I found peace in smaller things. Emily began visiting me in my apartment. At first, Daniel resisted, but children see through the armor of adults. She wanted to know her grandfather. We'd sit together at my worn table, drinking hot cocoa, playing old card games. She'd ask about her father as a boy, and I'd tell her stories. Good ones, the ones that reminded me of the boy I once knew. Sometimes, when she laughed, I felt the ache in my chest ease. It reminded me that not all was lost, that the future didn't have to inherit Daniel's cruelty. One quiet evening, I walked past my old house. The new owners were renovating it, lights glowing through the window. I didn't feel anger anymore. I felt gratitude. That chapter was closed. My roots weren't bound to bricks and mortar. They were bound to the memories I carried, and to the dignity I had reclaimed. I thought back to Thanksgiving, to the humiliation of being called forgetful, of being painted as a senile old man who had lost his grip. And then I thought of Christmas, of Daniel's face when I revealed the truth. One moment stripped me of dignity, the other gave it back. Respect. That's what this was always about. Not money, not houses, not even revenge. Respect for a life built in sweat and sacrifice. Respect for a father who gave everything he had so his son could rise higher. And the cruel truth is this: when children forget respect, they don't just dishonor their parents, they dishonor themselves. In the end, Daniel lost more than I did. He lost the trust of his family, the admiration of his peers, and the quiet pride that comes from honoring your roots. I may have lost my house, but I kept my soul. And that, I've learned, is what matters most. So if there's a lesson in all of this, it's simple. Wealth without respect is nothing. Power without honor is hollow. And those who betray the hands that once lifted them will one day find their own hands empty. I don't know what history will write about my son, but I know what it will write about me, that I was not erased, that I stood my ground, that I remembered who I was, even when others tried to make me forget. And that, in the end, was enough. Thank you for watching this story until the very end. Stories like this remind us how deeply family, respect, and dignity matter in our lives. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever experienced betrayal or seen respect fade where it should have been strongest? Share your experience in the comments. I read each one. And if this story moved you, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more.